She was a widow who took in a mute girl that nobody wanted, and that child led her to a secret that had been buried for 20 years. Can you imagine opening your home to a child everyone else had rejected, only to discover she holds the key to a mystery that destroyed multiple families? This isn't just a story about adoption or compassion. It's a story about buried truth, stolen justice, and how sometimes the most powerless among us carry the most important messages. This really happened in the Ozark Mountains of Missouri in 1897. Before we continue, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and leave your like, because what this widow discovered will shock you and prove that every child deserves a chance, no matter how broken they seem. What this little girl couldn't say with words, she said in other ways. And what she revealed brought justice to the innocent and punishment to the guilty after 2 decades of lies. Tell me here in the comments, what state are you watching this story from? I'd love to know how far these emotional stories are reaching. It was late autumn of 1897 when Catherine Walsh first saw the girl. Catherine was 42 years old, a widow for 3 years after her husband Patrick died in a logging accident in the dense forests of southern Missouri. They'd never had children, though they'd wanted them desperately. Something about Catherine's body just wouldn't allow it. 5 pregnancies, 5 losses, each one breaking her heart a little more until finally the doctors told her to stop trying, or she'd kill herself. After Patrick died, Catherine sold their small farm and moved into the town of West Plains, a modest settlement in the Ozark foothills. She supported herself by taking in sewing and mending, doing laundry for the wealthier families, and occasionally helping at the general store during busy seasons. It was a simple life, quiet and lonely, but it was hers. The girl appeared in town on a Wednesday in October. She came with the county sheriff, a gruff man named Cyrus Blackwood, who arrived on horseback leading a small wagon. In the back of that wagon, huddled under a thin blanket despite the cold, was a child of perhaps 9 or 10 years old. She was thin to the point of emaciation, with tangled dark hair that hung to her waist, enormous brown eyes that seemed to take up half her face, and she was filthy, covered in dirt and what looked like soot. Sheriff Blackwood pulled the wagon up in front of the general store and climbed down heavily. He was not a kind man, Catherine knew. He was the type who believed justice was whatever kept the peace and protected property, not necessarily what was right. "Anyone interested in taking in an orphan?" he called out to the small crowd that had gathered. "Found her living in the woods up near Greer Spring. Been out there alone for God knows how long. She's touched in the head, won't speak, probably can't. But she can work, I reckon. Good for chores and such." Catherine pushed through the crowd to get a better look. The child sat in the wagon bed, knees drawn up to her chest, rocking slightly back and forth. She didn't make eye contact with anyone, just stared at her own bare, dirty feet. "How long has she been out there alone?" Catherine asked. "No telling," Blackwood said. "Could be weeks, could be months. Found her living in a cave, eating roots and whatever she could catch, wild as a deer. Took 4 men to catch her and get her in this wagon. What about her family? Where did she come from? Don't know. She won't talk. Can't talk, more like. I figure she's simple, maybe born that way. Maybe something happened to her. Either way, she needs a home or she goes to the orphanage in Springfield. And we all know what that place is like." Catherine did know. The state orphanage was overcrowded, underfunded, and brutal. Children who went there often didn't come out whole, if they came out at all. She looked at the girl again. As if sensing Catherine's gaze, the child's eyes flickered up for just a moment. And in that brief glance, Catherine saw something that made her breath catch. Not vacancy, not simpleness, but intelligence and fear, deep, profound fear. "I'll take her," Catherine heard herself say. The crowd murmured. Blackwood looked at her skeptically. "Mrs. Walsh, with all respect, you're a widow living alone. You sure you can handle a wild child? She might be dangerous. Might have disease. She's a child, Sheriff. A terrified, starving child. I'll take her." "Give me the paperwork," Blackwood shrugged. "Your funeral?" "Sign here." Catherine signed the papers that made her legal guardian of Jane Doe, as the sheriff had labeled her. No one knew the girl's real name. No one knew anything about her. She was a mystery wrapped in silence. Catherine helped the girl down from the wagon. The child flinched at her touch but didn't pull away. Up close, Catherine could see she was even worse off than she'd thought. The girl's arms were covered in scratches and old scars. Her feet were cut and infected. She smelled of wood smoke and earth and unwashed bodies. But her eyes, those enormous brown eyes, held a depth that spoke of terrible knowledge. "Come on, sweetheart," Catherine said gently. "Let's get you home. Get you clean and fed." The girl didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge that Catherine had spoken. She just followed, walking with a strange, careful gait, as if she was used to moving through the forest silently. At Catherine's small house on the edge of town, she drew a bath, heating water on the stove and filling the tin tub. The girl stood in the corner of the kitchen, watching everything with those huge eyes, ready to bolt at any moment. "It's all right," Catherine said softly. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm going to help you get clean. Would you like that? To be clean and warm?" No response. Catherine approached slowly, like she might approach a wounded animal. "I'm going to help you take off these clothes. They're rags anyway. We'll burn them and get you something clean. Is that all right?" She reached for the girl's shirt. The child jerked back violently, a sound escaping her throat. Not a word, but a sound of pure panic. Catherine froze. Okay, you do it. You undress yourself. I'll turn around." Catherine turned her back, giving the girl privacy. After a long moment, she heard the rustle of clothes being removed. "You can get in the tub now," Catherine said without turning around. She heard water splash, heard a small sigh. When she turned back, the girl was sitting in the tub, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around them. And Catherine could see her back. Catherine gasped, her hand going to her mouth. The girl's back was a map of scars. Old scars, years old from beatings, whip marks, burns, and something else. On her left shoulder blade, a brand. Like you'd brand cattle. It was old, the skin puckered and healed, but still visible. The letter M burned into this child's flesh. Catherine felt rage surge through her, hot and violent. Who had done this? What monster had tortured a child this way? She forced herself to breathe, to calm down. The girl was watching her with those knowing eyes, waiting to see how Catherine would react. "Sweetheart," Catherine said, her voice shaking but gentle. "Who did this to you?" The girl just stared. "Can you tell me your name?" "Anything. Nothing." The girl's lips didn't even move. Catherine spent the next hour carefully washing the girl, being gentle around the injuries and scars, talking softly the whole time about nothing important. The weather, the town, the house, just filling the silence with a calm, soothing voice. When the girl was clean, Catherine could see she was actually quite pretty under all that grime. High cheekbones, a delicate face, that thick dark hair that shone when it was clean. She looked to be about 9 years old, maybe 10, small for her age, probably from malnutrition. Catherine dressed her in one of her own nightgowns, which hung huge on the tiny frame, and led her to the small second bedroom. "This is your room now," Catherine said. "You'll sleep here. You're safe here. Do you understand? You're safe." The girl looked at the bed as if she'd never seen one before. She approached it cautiously, touched the quilt, then looked at Catherine with something like confusion. "Yes, it's for you. You sleep in the bed. Go ahead." The girl climbed onto the bed, but instead of lying down, she curled up in the corner where the wall met the headboard, making herself as small as possible. It broke Catherine's heart. That night, Catherine lay in her own bed listening to the sounds of the girl crying softly in the next room. Not loud, hiccuping sobs, but quiet, muffled crying, as if she was used to having to cry silently. Catherine wanted to go comfort her, but sensed that would frighten the child more. So she just lay there listening, her heart breaking. The next few weeks were incredibly difficult. The girl wouldn't speak, wouldn't make any sound at all. She ate like a starving animal, fast and defensive, as if someone might take the food away at any moment. She flinched at sudden movements. She wouldn't sleep in the bed, instead curling up on the floor in the corner. But slowly, gradually, she began to trust Catherine. Little things. She stopped flinching quite so much when Catherine moved near her. She started sleeping on top of the bed instead of under it. She let Catherine comb her hair without panicking, and she began to follow Catherine around the house, watching everything she did with intense focus. Catherine noticed the girl was remarkably intelligent. She learned tasks incredibly quickly. How to wash dishes, how to fold laundry, how to sweep. She seemed desperate to be useful, to earn her keep, as if she was afraid Catherine would send her away if she wasn't valuable. "You don't have to work so hard," Catherine told her. "You're not a servant. You're my daughter now if you'll have me. You can just be a child." But the girl didn't seem to know how to be a child. One day, about a month after the girl arrived, Catherine was teaching her how to sew. The girl watched intently as Catherine demonstrated a basic stitch. Then she took the needle and thread and executed the stitch perfectly on her first try. "You've done this before," Catherine said, surprised. The girl nodded. It was the first clear communication she'd made. "Someone taught you to sew?" Another nod. "Was it your mother?" The girl's face crumpled. She shook her head violently and dropped the sewing, running to her room. Catherine found her later, curled in her corner, rocking. "I'm sorry," Catherine said. "I didn't mean to upset you." "We don't have to talk about your mother." But this incident made Catherine think. The girl had skills, had been taught things. She wasn't born wild. Something had happened to her. Something terrible. And whatever it was, it had stolen her voice. Winter came, cold and harsh. Catherine named the girl Hope because that's what she represented. Hope for a future, hope for healing, hope for justice someday. The girl didn't protest the name, so Hope she became. Hope settled into a routine. She helped Catherine with chores. She sat by the fire in the evenings while Catherine read aloud. She was learning to relax, to feel safe, but she still wouldn't speak. Couldn't or wouldn't, Catherine wasn't sure which. One snowy afternoon in December, Catherine took Hope to the general store to buy supplies for Christmas. It was Hope's first time back in town since arriving. She stayed close to Catherine, holding her hand tightly, her eyes darting around at all the people. They were looking at ribbons when a man entered the store. He was tall, well-dressed, with a thick mustache and cold blue eyes. A wealthy man, clearly from one of the big families that owned land around West Plains. The moment Hope saw him, she went rigid. Her hand squeezed Catherine so hard it hurt. She started to shake. Catherine looked down at her. Hope's face had gone absolutely white. Her eyes were locked on the man, and the expression in them was pure, undiluted terror. The man was talking to the shopkeeper, something about ordering supplies for his ranch. He hadn't noticed them yet. Catherine made a decision. "Come on, Hope, let's go." She tried to lead the girl out, but Hope wouldn't move. Couldn't move. She was frozen, staring at the man. And then he turned. His eyes swept the store and landed on Hope. For just a moment, a fraction of a second, his face registered something. Shock? Recognition? Fear? Then it was gone, replaced by polite confusion. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat to Catherine. "Is something wrong with your girl?" "She's not feeling well," Catherine said quickly. "We need to go." She managed to break Hope's paralysis and pulled her out of the store. Outside in the cold air, Hope collapsed. Her legs just gave out. She sat in the snow, shaking violently, making no sound but clearly having some kind of fit. "Hope, Hope, what's wrong?" "Do you know that man?" The girl looked up at Catherine and nodded. Then she opened her mouth and tried to speak. Her lips formed words, but no sound came out. She was trying so hard, the effort showing on her face, but nothing. Tears streamed down her cheeks in frustration. Catherine knelt in the snow beside her. "It's all right. You don't have to talk. Can you show me? Can you draw it or act it out?" Hope nodded frantically. They went home immediately. Catherine gave Hope paper and a pencil, the first time the girl had been given such things. Hope stared at the pencil for a moment, then gripped it awkwardly. She could sew, could do physical tasks, but writing was different. She tried to write but couldn't form letters properly. She'd never learned or had forgotten. So instead she drew. The first drawing was simple but clear. A house, a big house with columns in front. Then she drew stick figures. A tall man, a woman, and several children, one smaller than the others. She pointed to the smallest figure, herself. Catherine watched, her heart pounding. Hope drew more. The man figure, bigger now, looming over the small girl figure. Then the girl figure on the ground with marks around her representing, what, hits? Violence? Hope's hand was shaking as she drew. She drew the woman figure turning away, not looking. She drew the other children, also turned away. Then she drew something that made Catherine's blood run cold. Fire. She drew the house on fire. Drew the woman and the other children as X'd-out figures, dead, and drew herself and the man figure separately, alive. The house burned. Catherine whispered, "Your family died, all except you and that man." Hope nodded vigorously. She drew more, herself in a small space, bars on the windows, a cellar or prison. She drew days passing, marked by little moon symbols. Many, many moons. Months. She'd been locked up for months. Then she drew herself running, little lines indicating movement, escaping, living in the forest. And finally, she pointed to the drawing of the man and then gestured toward town, toward the general store. That man in the store, he's the man from your house. Hope nodded and tears fell onto her drawing, smudging the pencil marks. Catherine felt her mind racing. This man, whoever he was connected to Hope's past, to her trauma, to her silence. Hope, did that man hurt you? A nod. Did he do this to you? Catherine gently touched Hope's shoulder, where the brand was hidden under her dress. Hope's face crumpled and she nodded, pulling her collar down to show the scarred M. She pointed at the drawing of the man emphatically. He branded you like an animal. Catherine felt rage building in her chest. Who is he, Hope? Can you tell me his name? Hope tried again to speak, her mouth forming words, but nothing came out. The frustration was agonizing to watch. She grabbed the pencil again and tried to write letters. She managed to scrawl in shaky, barely legible writing. M-A-S-O-N. Mason. The man's name was Mason. Catherine knew that name. Everyone in the county knew that name. Mason. The Mason family was one of the wealthiest in the region. They owned thousands of acres, ran cattle, had mining interests, old money, going back generations, powerful, connected, untouchable. The man in the store must have been Richard Mason, the current patriarch of the family. He was about 50 years old, widowed, with 2 adult sons, respected, feared, and apparently a monster. Hope, listen to me carefully. Did Richard Mason keep you locked up? Did he hurt you? Nod. And the fire. The one that killed your family. Did he set that fire? Hope's eyes locked on Catherine's. And slowly, deliberately, she nodded. Catherine felt the world tilt. This child was a witness to murder. Multiple murders. That's why she'd been living in the woods. She'd escaped from Mason and been hiding, terrified he'd find her. And that's why she couldn't speak. Trauma? Or had Mason done something to her to ensure her silence? Hope, why can't you speak? Did Mason do something to your throat? Did he hurt you there? Hope touched her throat, then shook her head. She pointed to her drawings again, specifically to an image she'd drawn of herself, screaming silently. Catherine understood. Psychological trauma. The girl had probably screamed and screamed while locked in that cellar and no one came. Or worse, something so terrible had happened that her mind had shut down her voice to protect her. Selective mutism, the doctors called it. A response to extreme trauma. We have to tell someone, Catherine said. We have to tell the sheriff. Hope's reaction was violent. She shook her head frantically, grabbed Catherine's arm hard enough to bruise, her eyes wild with fear. Hope, we can't let him get away with this. But Hope was panicking. She ran to her corner and curled up, making herself as small as possible. And Catherine realized the problem. Sheriff Blackwood. He was in Mason's pocket. Everyone knew it. The Masons owned half the county, including the sheriff. If Catherine went to Blackwood with this story, Mason would be warned. And Hope would disappear. Or worse. Catherine sat on the floor next to Hope's corner. Okay, I won't go to the sheriff. Not yet. But Hope, we need proof. We need something more than drawings. Can you show me where you were kept? Can you take me to the Mason property? Hope looked at her for a long moment. Then slowly she nodded. 3 days later, Catherine and Hope set out on horseback. Catherine had made excuses about visiting a cousin in a neighboring county. She didn't want anyone, especially Mason, knowing what they were doing. The Mason estate was about 15 miles from West Plains, a sprawling property with the main house set back from the road, surrounded by forest and farmland. Hope led the way. Though Catherine could see it terrified her to return. They approached from the back, through the woods, staying hidden. Hope dismounted when they were about a quarter-mile from the main house and led Catherine on foot through dense undergrowth. They came to a small outbuilding far from the main house, probably an old overseer's cottage or storage building. Hope pointed at it, then at herself. This is where he kept you. Nod. They approached carefully. The building was locked, but Catherine managed to force the door with a sturdy stick. Inside, it was exactly as Hope had drawn. One room with a dirt floor, bars on the single small window. A thin mattress in the corner. Shackles attached to the wall. It was a prison, a cell for keeping someone hidden. Catherine felt sick. Hope pointed to things, showing Catherine details she'd drawn. Scratches on the wall where she'd tried to mark days. Stains on the floor that looked like dried blood. And in the corner, partially hidden under loose floorboards, Hope dug out something and handed it to Catherine. A small leather journal. Catherine opened it with shaking hands. The pages were filled with neat feminine handwriting. A diary. She flipped to the front. Property of Margaret Mason. Catherine's hands shook. Margaret Mason, Richard Mason's wife. Hope, is this your mother's diary? Hope nodded, tears streaming down her face. Catherine flipped through the pages, reading passages. The entries started normal enough. Daily life on a wealthy estate. But as she read further, the tone changed. Margaret Mason began writing about her husband's temper, his violence, how he beat her, how he beat the children, how she was planning to leave him, to take the children and run. The entries became more desperate. He's found out I've been taking money from the household accounts. He knows I'm planning to leave. I'm terrified. What will he do? And then the final entry. May 15th, 1895. I can't wait any longer. Tonight, while Richard is away, I'm taking the children and leaving. I've arranged passage on the train from Springfield. If anything happens to me, if we don't make it, know that I tried. Know that I love my children more than my own life. God protect us. The entry was dated May 15th, 1895, 2.5 years ago. Catherine looked at Hope. What happened that night? Hope's face was a mask of pain. She gestured, acting out the scene. Her mother waking her up, packing a bag. The other children being woken. They were heading to the door when Richard came home early. He'd suspected. He'd been waiting. Hope acted out violence. Her mother trying to protect the children, being struck down. Richard dragging Margaret away. Then Richard returning, his face cold and locking the children in their rooms. Hope's gestures became frantic, showing flames, smoke, the house burning. She'd been in her room, locked in, and the house was on fire. She'd broken the window, cut herself getting out and run. She'd seen the house engulfed in flames, heard screaming, but she'd run into the forest and hidden. Catherine pieced it together. Richard Mason had murdered his wife, then set fire to the house with his children inside to destroy the evidence and make it look like a tragic accident. But Hope had escaped, and Mason couldn't find her in the dark and the chaos. He'd probably looked, probably hunted for her. That's why he'd kept the little prison building. He must have caught her later, months later, and locked her up, trying to decide what to do with her. But Hope had escaped again. Somehow she'd gotten free and disappeared into the vast Ozark wilderness, where she'd lived like a wild animal for months until Sheriff Blackwood found her. And Mason had probably been searching for her this whole time, terrified that she'd talk, that his crimes would be revealed. That's why he'd looked so shocked in the general store. He'd seen the ghost he thought he'd finally gotten rid of. Hope, we have to expose him. Your mother's diary is evidence. Your scars are evidence. We can bring him to justice. But how? Sheriff Blackwood wouldn't help. The local judge was Mason's friend. The Mason family had connections throughout Missouri. Catherine was just a poor widow. Her word against one of the most powerful men in the county. They'd laugh at her. Or worse, they'd make her disappear too. We need to go to St. Louis, Catherine said suddenly, to the federal marshal. Get someone who isn't in Mason's pocket. Hope looked uncertain but nodded. They took the diary, careful to leave everything else as they'd found it, and made their way back to their horses. They just reached the tree line when they heard it. A voice calling out, "Who's there?" "This is private property." A man on horseback, one of Mason's ranch hands, had spotted them. Catherine and Hope ran, crashing through the underbrush, reaching their horses and mounting quickly. They rode hard, the ranch hand pursuing. For a terrifying 10 minutes, they galloped through the forest, branches whipping past them, Catherine holding Hope in front of her on the saddle. Finally, they reached the main road and the ranch hand gave up the chase, probably not wanting to be seen pursuing a woman and child publicly. But the damage was done. Mason would know someone had been on his property. Would know someone had been to the old prison building. He'd be on guard now. Catherine and Hope rode straight home, Catherine's mind racing. They needed to leave. Tonight. Get to St. Louis as fast as possible. But she needed money for train tickets, for a hotel, for a lawyer. She had some savings, but would it be enough? That night, Catherine was packing their few belongings when she heard horses outside. Many horses. She looked out the window and her blood froze. 6 men on horseback surrounding her house, and at the front, Richard Mason himself. There was a pounding on the door. "Mrs. Walsh, open up. We need to speak with you." Catherine grabbed Hope, who was frozen with fear. "The back door." "We run for the neighbors." But when they reached the back door, there were men there too. They were surrounded. The front door splintered open. Richard Mason walked in, flanked by two large men. His face was calm, but his eyes were ice. "Mrs. Walsh, I understand you have something that belongs to me. I don't know what you're talking about. You've broken into my home. I'll call the sheriff. Sheriff Blackwood is aware of the situation. In fact, he'll be joining us shortly. Now, I'll ask politely one more time. You have a girl here. A girl who belongs to me. I want her back." Catherine stepped in front of Hope. "She doesn't belong to anyone. She's a child, a human being, and she's under my care." Mason's calm cracked slightly. "That girl is a liar and a thief. She stole from me and ran away. I have every right to retrieve my property. Your property. She's not property. And I know what you did, Mason. I know about your wife, about your children, about the fire." The room went very quiet. Mason's face turned dangerous. "You don't know anything. You're repeating the fantasies of a mute child who's clearly insane. No one will believe a word of it. I have your wife's diary, Margaret Mason's diary. She wrote about your violence, about how she was planning to leave you, about how she was afraid of you." Catherine pulled the diary from her bag. "This is evidence, Mason. Evidence of murder." Mason stared at the diary, and for the first time, Catherine saw real fear in his eyes. "Where did you get that?" "Where you kept Hope prisoner. In that little building where you locked her up after you murdered her family. You're insane." But his voice wavered. "Am I? Should we let a federal marshal decide? I'm sure they'd be very interested in investigating the fire that killed the Mason family. Interested in examining this diary. Interested in the brand on Hope's back. The letter M for Mason, I presume. You branded a child like cattle to mark her as yours." Mason's hand went to his belt, where Catherine now saw he was wearing a gun. "You stupid woman. You have no idea what you've done. That diary dies here. That girl dies here. And you'll have a tragic accident. House fire, probably. It happens." But Catherine had expected violence. She'd prepared. From behind her back, she pulled out Patrick's old revolver, which she'd loaded before Mason arrived. "Get out of my house!" Mason laughed, but it was an ugly sound. "You won't shoot me. You're a church-going woman. You don't have it in you. Try me. You murdered children, Mason. Your own children. You burned them alive. And you would have killed Hope if she hadn't escaped. So yes, I absolutely have it in me." They stood there, locked in standoff. Catherine's hands were shaking, but she kept the gun pointed at Mason's chest. Hope stood behind her, silent as always, but Catherine could feel her small hand gripping the back of Catherine's dress. And then, from outside, a new voice. "Everyone stay where they are. U.S. Marshal's office." Marshal William Hayes entered the house, followed by two deputies, all armed. Catherine nearly collapsed with relief. "Marshal Hayes, thank God." Hayes was a tall, gray-haired man with a weathered face and sharp eyes. He looked around the room, taking in the situation instantly. "Mr. Mason, step away from Mrs. Walsh. You men outside, lay down your weapons." "This is a private matter, Marshal," Mason said, but his confident tone was gone. "Breaking and entering is a federal crime when it involves kidnapping. Mrs. Walsh sent me a telegraph yesterday asking for help. Said she had information about a murder. I'd like to hear it. Catherine hadn't sent any telegraph. She'd barely had time to think. But then she noticed a figure in the doorway. The shopkeeper from the general store, Mr. Potter. He caught her eye and gave a tiny nod. He'd seen what happened that day in the store, seen Hope's reaction to Mason, and he'd sent for help. Marshal, this man is Richard Mason. 28 months ago, his wife Margaret and his 3 children died in a house fire at his estate. It was ruled an accidental fire, but it wasn't. Mason murdered his wife and set the fire to kill his children. This girl, Hope, is his daughter, the only survivor. She escaped. He's been hunting her for years. And I have proof. Catherine handed the diary to Marshal Hayes. He flipped through it, reading passages, his face growing darker. Mr. Mason, you're going to need to come with me for questioning. This is ridiculous. That's a forgery. That girl is a mute idiot who can't testify to anything, and this woman is a hysterical widow. You have nothing. I have a diary detailing abuse and plans to escape. I have a child with a brand burned into her flesh bearing your initial. I have a building on your property set up as a prison cell, and I have a dozen witnesses who can testify that you just broke into this woman's home with armed men. That's enough to hold you while I investigate. Now, are you coming peacefully, or do we do this the hard way? Mason looked around the room. He was outnumbered and outgunned. His face twisted with rage, but he raised his hands. This isn't over. I have lawyers. I have friends in high places. You'll regret this, all of you. As the deputies led Mason away in shackles, Hope moved from behind Catherine. She walked right up to Mason, looked him in the eye, and did something extraordinary. She spoke. It was barely more than a whisper, rough and cracking from years of disuse, but it was clear. I remember everything. 3 words. But they were enough. Mason's face went white. Because if Hope could speak, she could testify. His defense that she was mute and therefore unable to give evidence was shattered. Hope turned away from him and walked back to Catherine, burying her face in Catherine's skirt. Catherine held her, stroking her hair, tears streaming down her face. The trial of Richard Mason was the biggest news in Missouri in 1898. The prosecution presented Margaret Mason's diary. They presented Hope, who testified in a small, halting voice about the abuse, about the night her mother tried to leave, about watching her father drag her mother away, and later seeing the house burn. She testified about being locked in the cellar for months, about the brand he burned into her skin, so I'd always remember who owned me, about finally escaping and living in the forest because she was too terrified to trust anyone. Medical experts testified about her scars, her brand, her trauma. Investigators examined the old prison building and found Hope's blood and hair samples. They exhumed the bodies from the fire and found evidence that Margaret Mason had been beaten to death before the fire, and that the children's room doors had been locked from the outside. The defense tried to discredit Hope, calling her a damaged child, a liar, possibly delusional. But her testimony was too detailed, too consistent, and the physical evidence backed up every word. Richard Mason was found guilty of 4 counts of murder. He was hanged on a cold January morning in 1899. Hope did not attend the execution. She was home with Catherine, finally safe. After the trial, Catherine legally adopted Hope. The girl's real name, they discovered from birth records, was Hope Margaret Mason, so the name Catherine had given her was actually her birth name. It felt like fate. Hope's voice came back slowly. At first just whispers, then quiet sentences, and eventually, by the time she was 12, she spoke normally, though she was always soft-spoken. She never fully explained why she'd lost her voice. The doctor said it was a psychological response to trauma so severe her mind had shut down her ability to speak as a protective measure. By not speaking, she couldn't be forced to tell what she'd seen, and she'd survived because of it. Hope grew up to be a beautiful, intelligent, compassionate young woman. She became a teacher, working with children who'd experienced trauma. She never married, choosing instead to dedicate her life to helping others. And she never left Catherine's side until the day Catherine died peacefully at age 78, with Hope holding her hand. Hope was with her when she passed, and Catherine's last words were, "My daughter, my brave, beautiful daughter." Hope inherited Catherine's house and lived there until her own death in 1956 at age 68. In her will, she left the house and all her possessions to establish a home for abused children, a safe place where they could heal and learn to trust again. That home still operates today, though it's been expanded and modernized. It's called the Catherine Walsh House for Children, named after the woman who saved Hope's life by seeing value in a broken, silent child that nobody else wanted. On the wall of the main building, there's a plaque. It reads, "Founded in memory of Catherine Walsh, who proved that every child deserves love, protection, and a voice. And in honor of Hope Margaret Mason, who survived the unsurvivable and spent her life ensuring no child would suffer as she did. Speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. Protect those who cannot protect themselves. Love the unloved." That is our mission. Every year on the anniversary of Hope's adoption, the children at the home gather, and someone reads the story of the mute girl and the widow who saved her. It's a reminder that sometimes the most powerless among us carry the most important truths. That silence doesn't mean there's nothing to say, and that one person choosing to care, choosing to act, choosing to fight for justice can change everything. Hope's story teaches us that trauma can steal our voice, but it can't steal our truth. That the love of one good person can help us heal from even the most horrific tentar, novament, or continuer abuse. And that children, even when they can't speak, are always watching, always remembering, always knowing. Richard Mason thought he could murder his family and get away with it because he was wealthy, powerful, connected. He thought a silent child couldn't hurt him. He was wrong. Hope's silence protected her until she found someone she could trust. And when that moment came, her voice, however small and broken, was enough to bring down a monster. Catherine Walsh thought she was just a lonely widow taking in an unwanted child out of compassion. She had no idea she was saving a witness to murder. Had no idea this one act of kindness would lead to justice for 4 innocent people who'd been silenced forever. She simply saw a terrified child and chose to help. That's all it took. One person choosing to care. After Hope's testimony put Mason on trial, dozens of other stories came out. Workers on the Mason estate who'd witnessed abuse but been too afraid to speak. Neighbors who'd heard screams but looked the other way. A doctor who'd treated Margaret's injuries but accepted Mason's excuses. An entire community that had failed to protect a vulnerable family because the abuser was powerful. The case changed Missouri law. It led to reforms in how domestic violence was investigated, especially in wealthy families. It led to requirements that doctors report suspected abuse. It established that children could testify in court even if they'd been traumatized. Hope's case became precedent, cited in legal documents for decades afterward. But perhaps most importantly, it reminded people that evil can hide behind respectability. That wealth and status don't make someone good. That we have a responsibility to protect the vulnerable, even when it's inconvenient or dangerous. Because if we don't, who will? Marshal Hayes, the federal marshal who arrested Mason, later told reporters, "I've seen a lot of evil in my years as a lawman. But what Richard Mason did to his own family, to his own child, that was a special kind of darkness. And what that little girl survived, the strength it took to keep living, to keep fighting, to finally speak her truth, that's a special kind of courage. Hope Mason is a hero, and Catherine Walsh is a hero. They're the kind of people who make me believe humanity is worth saving." The shopkeeper, Mr. Potter, who'd sent the telegraph that brought Marshal Hayes, never took credit publicly. But privately, he told Catherine, "I saw that child's face when Mason walked in. I saw pure terror, and I knew something was very wrong. I couldn't ignore that. No decent person could. I just did what needed doing." That's the thing about heroism. It's often quiet. It's often just people doing what needs doing, even when it's hard or scary. Catherine wasn't trying to be a hero. She was just trying to give a child a home. Mr. Potter wasn't trying to be a hero. He was just refusing to ignore suffering. Hope wasn't trying to be a hero. She was just trying to survive. But together, their small acts of courage created something bigger. Justice, healing, change. That's how it works. One person can't change the world alone. But one person choosing to do the right thing can inspire others. Can create a ripple effect. Can be the first domino that leads to transformation. Think about your own life. Have you ever seen someone in need and looked away because it wasn't your problem? Have you ever suspected something was wrong but stayed silent because speaking up would be uncomfortable? Have you ever walked past suffering because helping would be inconvenient? We all have. We're all guilty of it sometimes. It's human nature to avoid conflict, to protect ourselves, to assume someone else will handle it. But Hope's story asks us, what if you're the only one who will handle it? What if your intervention is the difference between life and death, justice and injustice, hope and despair? Can you really live with yourself if you do nothing? Catherine Walsh couldn't. She saw a traumatized child that everyone else rejected, and she couldn't walk away. That simple choice, that moment of compassion, saved Hope's life, gave her a future, and eventually brought a murderer to justice. One person, one choice, everything changed. That's the power we all have. Every single day, we're presented with opportunities to help, to speak up, to act. Most of them aren't as dramatic as Hope's situation. Most are small. A coworker being bullied, a neighbor struggling alone, a child who seems neglected, a friend making dangerous choices. These moments where we can intervene, can offer help, can be a voice for someone who has no voice. And yes, sometimes helping is risky. Catherine risked her life confronting Mason. Mr. Potter risked retaliation by going to the federal marshal. Hope risked everything by trusting Catherine and later by testifying. Doing the right thing isn't always safe, but it's always right. Hope lived until 1956. She had 44 years of life after her rescue. 44 years she wouldn't have had if Catherine had walked past her in that wagon and thought, not my problem. In those years, Hope became a teacher and helped hundreds of traumatized children. She gave comfort, hope, and healing to kids who'd suffered as she had. And those children grew up and helped others. The ripple continues. How many lives were ultimately saved because Catherine chose compassion that one afternoon in October 1897? Impossible to calculate, but hundreds certainly, maybe thousands, through the generations, all because one widow decided a broken child was worth saving. Before we end this story, I want you to know what happened to some of the other people involved. Sheriff Cyrus Blackwood was investigated after the Mason trial revealed his corruption. He was found guilty of accepting bribes and obstruction of justice. He served 5 years in prison and died shortly after his release, broken and disgraced. His story is a reminder that enabling evil makes you complicit in it. Marshal William Hayes continued his work for another 15 years before retiring. He kept in touch with Catherine and Hope, visiting them several times. At his retirement party, he said his proudest moment as a lawman wasn't the outlaws he caught or the bank robberies he solved. It was arresting Richard Mason. Because that time, he said, I protected a child, and there's no higher calling than that. Mr. Potter, the shopkeeper who sent for the marshal, became close friends with Catherine. When she was elderly and could no longer work, he made sure she never went without, quietly paying her bills and ensuring she had everything she needed. He never spoke publicly about his role in the Mason case, but Catherine knew, and Hope knew, and they made sure his kindness was never forgotten. The Catherine Walsh House for Children, which Hope founded with her inheritance, has now been operating for over 65 years. It's helped more than 3,000 children escape abuse, heal from trauma, and build new lives. Many of those children grew up to be teachers, social workers, counselors, and advocates, carrying forward Hope's legacy of turning suffering into service. On the grounds of the home, there's a garden. In the center of that garden is a statue. It shows a woman kneeling down to the level of a small girl, reaching out her hand. The woman is Catherine. The girl is Hope, and carved into the base are the words Hope spoke that day in Catherine's kitchen, her first words in years. I remember everything. It's a reminder that truth cannot be buried forever, that voices can be silenced, but they can also be restored, that the vulnerable among us have stories worth hearing, truths worth protecting, lives worth saving, and that sometimes all it takes is one person willing to listen. So I ask you now, if you encountered a Hope in your life, would you be a Catherine? Would you see past the dirt and the fear and the silence to the human being underneath? Would you risk your comfort, your safety, your life to protect someone powerless? Would you be the voice for someone who has no voice? I hope you would. I believe you would. Because that capacity for compassion, for courage, for choosing the hard right over the easy wrong, it lives in all of us. We just have to choose it. Hope chose to survive when survival seemed impossible. Catherine chose to care when indifference would have been easier. Mr. Potter chose to act when silence would have been safer. Marshal Hayes chose justice over corruption. And together they created a story of hope, redemption, and triumph over evil. That's what I want you to take from this story. Not just that bad things happen, though they do. Not just that evil people exist, though they do. But that good people exist too. People who refuse to look away. People who stand up even when they're terrified. People who choose love over fear, action over apathy, courage over comfort. Be one of those people. The world desperately needs more of them. Look around your community. Who's the hope in your neighborhood? The silent one, the invisible one, the one everyone else has written off as too broken or too difficult or too much trouble. See them, really see them, because you might be their only chance. You might be the Catherine Walsh who saves their life. And if you're the hope, if you're the one who's been silenced by trauma or fear or abuse, please know this: you are not forgotten. You are not worthless. You are not beyond help. There are Catherine Walshes in this world, people who will see your value even when you can't see it yourself. People who will fight for you. People who will believe you. Don't give up. Keep surviving. Keep fighting. Your voice matters. Your truth matters. You matter. Hope Margaret Mason's life is proof of that. She survived the unsurvivable. She found her voice again. She brought evil to justice. And she spent the rest of her life making sure other children would be protected, believed, and saved. If she could do that after everything she endured, imagine what you can do. Imagine what we can all do if we choose compassion over indifference, courage over fear, action over apathy. Thank you for listening to Hope's story. Thank you for letting it into your heart. I hope it changes you the way it changed me. I hope it makes you more aware, more compassionate, more willing to act when you see suffering. Because that's how we honor Hope and Catherine, and all the silent children who are still waiting for someone to save them. We become their voices. We become their protectors. We become their hope. If this story moved you, please subscribe to the channel. Leave your like, and most importantly, share this story. Tell it to your family, your friends, your community. Because stories like this need to be remembered. They remind us of the worst humans can do, but more importantly, they remind us of the best we can be. And right now, the world needs that reminder more than ever. Tell me in the comments what state or country you're watching from. And if you've ever helped someone who couldn't help themselves, or if someone helped you when you needed it most, share your story. Let's create a community of hope, of people who refuse to look away, who choose to care, who make the world better, one act of kindness at a time. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring about Hope's story, about Catherine's courage, about justice for the voiceless. And remember, every child deserves protection. Every child deserves love. Every child deserves to be believed, to be valued, to be saved. Be the person who makes that happen. Be the Catherine Walsh in someone's life. Because you never know, you might be saving the next hope, and that hope might change the world. God bless you all. Stay compassionate, stay courageous, stay willing to act, and never ever walk past suffering and do nothing. Because in that moment, you're not just failing the person who needs help. You're failing yourself. You're failing humanity. Choose better, be better. The hopes of this world are counting on us. Until next time, remember Hope's words. I remember everything. The silent ones are always watching, always remembering. Let's make sure what they remember is people who cared enough to help. People like Catherine Walsh. People like you can be.